Thank you very much, Mr. Suryanarayana. I thank the panel for your insightful comments and also for keeping to the time. I'll be opening the general discussion soon because the symposium is really meant for the audience. But before I do that, let me identify some issues, some common issues that have emerged, and maybe those you will remember when you are asking your questions. I have identified 5 sets of issues among you 4. The first is that of anomaly. In everyday life, when one is talking about a relationship between two people, 2 countries, one would like to know where does the self end and the other start? Can the 2 partners define one another in terms of space? Now, we have heard that China shows parts of territory that India claims as her own, cartographically as Chinese. So there is this kind of anomaly in terms of the definition of one another. Has this visit brought clarity where anomaly used to be the rule? Do remember we're writing a report card and I've got my 5 criteria. The second, equality. It is hard to believe that there was a time after the Second World War when India recognized China and helped China to be recognized by others. The suave, sophisticated Nehru was showing around, mentoring Chow and Lai. I mean, those are the days long past. It was understood for a long time that there would be a subordinate and subordinate relationship between China and India. Has this visit brought some form of symmetry, or let's say equality, equal respect between these 2 countries? Third, very important, has a structure evolved which will make the next Indo-China war unlikely? After all, there is war and there is proxy war, and we all know where the terrorists come from and what role Pakistan and Pakistan's all-weather friend China have to play in that. Has this visit brought an infrastructure? Has it created a set of rules of good practice which will make the relationship a little more stable? Fourth, incentives. Surya, I took the point of mutually hurting stalemates. Does China ever hurt? Does China have an incentive to come towards India? Or in other words, is there any form of incentivization for this relationship to continue beyond where it is now? Or is it going to be mystical, magical, young in kind of cultural, anomalous relationship, or a normal business relationship? Finally, my 5th point, if Modi visit has achieved it all, what happened? What was happening before Modi? I mean, if there was an opportunity, why did others not see it? Or is it all hype, all drama? Or in other words, have we achieved a structural transformation of the 2 relationships, or does it remain dangerously and quite provisionally, because in politics people come, people go, personalized? I would open the general discussion now and ask you please to identify yourselves, ask your question, and to the extent possible, identify the speaker who should answer your question. I'll take sets of 3 questions. Hands up if you want to ask a question.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Gurdeep Singh from PTI News Agency in India. It may not be a question, just an observation. I had a chat with some very high-ranking businessman from India in Singapore who was visiting, and he said to me that no matter what happens about Chinese investment in India, it's not going to work till the border issue is settled. That reflected very strongly that the Indian businessmen are not very confident. Second point, Chinese investment in Vietnam was attacked. And Chinese investment in Pakistan, if you ever go ahead, will be protected by a special military unit for security reasons. In India, there are thoughts of giving one industrial estate or SEZ city to China to develop and let them go all the way there. The day the Chinese army move in any way, and they do regularly, they may not have done for a couple of days or a couple of months, but they do that up there in the mountains. The Indians will react. Will the Indians react? Are we that full of Shanti? Thank you. All of them. All.
Just two short comments and factual corrections. First, to Mr. Chaudhary. A simple comment is that even a Chinese diplomat couldn't have made a more eloquent presentation of the Chinese worldview. So thank you very much for that. And the factual correction is that China did get involved in the 1971 conflict. It was purely because the US moved into the Bay of Bengal that they backed off. So it's not correct to say that China did not try to get involved in the 71 conflict. And to Sindarpal Singh, who's a very young man, so he may not know 7,000 years of Indian history, but India in its entire history has never looked for power outside its own borders. There's no single event which establishes that. And in case you try to draw a difference between the Nehruvian and Gandhian philosophy and the BJP philosophy, let me tell you, power, becoming powerful to influence others is very different from becoming powerful so that no one fools with you. And this latter is not anti-Nehruvian or not anti-Gandhian either. So the two are very different concepts. Just again as a correction. Thank you.
Sir, could you identify yourself?
My name is Surya Sethi. I used to teach here at the School of Public Policy. Thank you.
I'm Ukrainian ambassador. My name is Pavlo Sultansky. I came here to learn opinion of esteemed scientists about the application of Russia towards relations between India and China, and in view of the fact that just recently two meetings between Indian leadership on one hand and the Chinese leadership on the other hand took place with Mr. Putin. I wonder whether this country was forgotten to be mentioned in most of your interventions, or maybe I omitted something during
Which
this.
country, sorry?
Russia.
Russia.
Russia and Mr. Putin, the president of Russia. He promised, if you look from the media coverage in Russia about relations of that country with India and China, you could understand that it is decisive in the global context. But United States, Southeast Asia, Pakistan, Japan were repeatedly mentioned here. Russia just once, if I'm not mistaken. And another very short question. It is not me, but many those experts who are analyzing the policy of China. They use win-win in a very different sense. In a very different sense. They mean that China tried to win twice. Thank you.
Thank you. We will have one more round at least. So, short quick answers. I'll now hand over questions to the panel.
Thank you. Well, Thank you very much, Mr. Sethi, for at least acknowledging the eloquence. But it's true. The Chinese have the problem, of course, language. When they speak to an English-speaking audience, there is an inherent problem there. But I would assume that if the Chinese spoke in Mandarin, they would be as eloquent as you think I have been in English. As to 71, 71 posed a huge problem for China. It was not a simple decision. You see, China had to decide between East Pakistan and West Pakistan. The Chinese had equal linkages with both East and West. So within Pakistan itself, the domestic situation, China was not in a position to intervene so easily. China had very strong empathy within East Pakistan. The Bhashani NAP party, etc., was considered pro-Chinese, and Pakistan was a strategic partner. What China was opposed to was Russia and the America potentially getting involved into the situation. When they vetoed Bangladesh's membership to the United Nations for the first time, Wang Wa explained this, and I was very involved with 71. I was a young officer then, both from the Pakistan side and Bangladesh side. And Wang Wa explained that, no, we're not against Bangladesh. We are against, and mind you the expression, singing in a duet of Soviet social imperialism and Indian expansionism. And that is why they vetoed Bangladesh. But when Bangladesh was accepted in the United Nations, they gave Bangladesh what they called an all-weather status, slightly below Pakistan, because Pakistan was comprehensive all-weather. The Chinese are very fond of this kind of pecking order arrangements, and India was and Bangladesh was all-weather. With regard to win-win, it is true when the Chinese say win-win relationship, it has been said that it may be a double win for them. It usually is. And someone asked at the Shangri-La dialogue of the Chinese admiral that, Admiral, could you tell us which other country has ever won? Yeah, I mean, vis-a-vis China. That is true. Putin was probably not born, not in our discussions, because he was not practically relevant to what we were saying. I was explaining the metrics on which, by which China operates regionally and globally, and my colleagues spoke to India's direct relationship with China. A small point about the lack of stridency in China. Even in terms of giving support, China could be restrained. North Korea, for instance, and I'll end with this small joke. It is said that North Korea was having some kind of a famine situation, and they sent a message to China, no food, send food. And China said, no food, tighten belts. And North Korea responded, send belts. Thank you. Thank you very
much. I'll respond to Gurdeep's question on investments. You know, I think Chinese investments are characteristically a bit different from the usual conception that we have of foreign investments coming into a country like India, because I don't think we can expect Chinese investments to be like the Korean or Japanese investments, because that has not been the pattern of Chinese investments elsewhere as well. Chinese have not really established factories or built large scales, because the Chinese efficiency is much more in processing, far more in the upper end of the value chain, and they're primarily efficient in trading. So to that extent, when we look at Chinese investments into India and the list of investors into India, we hardly find any mention of China among the main source countries. And this is where I think the way the Chinese are looking at India is also very characteristic of their economic strengths and operations. They're probably looking at India as a country where they can increasingly shift some of the functions which they think would be high value additive in the long run. There have been efforts by Lenovo to do those. There have been efforts by Huawei to do those. I agree with the security point. It remains a valid point. But I think the Chinese have been very deft in playing the game of hot economics and cold politics. That's a skill which they have developed across the world in a variety of places. And the best example is actually the Asian region. And in fact, I'm tempted to talk about the China-Philippines relationship, which has actually become economically robust each year, if one looks at that. I think the ball actually lies in India's court. And this is where I will allude to the phrase that Professor Mitra mentioned right at the beginning, personal chemistry. I think to a very large extent, Narendra Modi is taking the guarantee in this respect. And he is familiar to China, and China is also familiar to him.
Thank you. I think Gurdeep's question will be answered. I think Mr. Sethi's question. Hello again, sir. Sir, I don't think age is a hindrance to understanding history unless you're 7,000 years old yourself. So, right? Fair enough. And see, sir, there's a huge, at least a burgeoning academic debate, and one of your ex-colleagues, Kanti Bajpai, has been involved in this debate about whether India has a tradition to be a maritime power or a land power, right? So, in your point, that India hasn't projected power across over its shores, some people say by its projected power across the mass of the land, right? The Mughals expanded their influence. Other different kingdoms expanded their influence. And your second point, never expanded influence above its shores. British India used India to expand British influence right up to the Persian Gulf. So, well, then are the Mughals not Indian then? So who's your Indian? I mean, then you're getting into quite murky territory there in terms of definitions. But then who's the authentic Indian then? So only after 47. Pardon? So the Mughals are not Indians and the British are not. Okay, all right. Fair enough. I think we can have this over coffee. Your second point about power, power is about making sure people don't mess with you as opposed to going out there and messing with people, I think, sort of, yeah. Yeah, but sir, you see, the problem now is that kind of limited definition of power becomes problematic. I tell you what. Now, say you depend on oil to fund your economy. I mean, of all people, if there is a blockade on some of your sea lanes or communication, you need to be able to project power into the sea to make sure people don't blockade your supplies, right? I mean, the old definition of I don't get invaded, it's got a limited definition, because if something happens somewhere beyond, you need to be able to be part of the constellation of forces that can say we want to have open sea lanes or communications, for example. I mean, that's one way of answering a question. The other way, in a sense which I agree with you, is the Indian projection of power has happened, but not in a sense through force. I mean, what some historians, a huge argument, Rajesh just left, he's probably well placed to talk about this. The Indianization of Southeast Asia, for example. I mean, some people argue that's soft power. I mean, again, how you define power. I mean, so, but anyway, thank you, sir. Very, very interesting questions. So, yeah, sorry.
So, what Gurdeep's point about Chinese investments in India and Chinese willingness to invest in India until the border issue is settled to the satisfaction of China. Well, you know, $22 billion worth of investment agreements had been entered into during the visit of Modi to China recently. That's, of course, peanuts compared to what China gives Pakistan. And to believe that Chinese investments in India can make China develop an economic stake in the political stability of India going forward is, of course, not easy to conceptualize and not easy to even make it happen, for the simple reason that China has such a huge economy, and even if Chinese lose on their investments in India, that will not cost them very much. Then coming back to the questions raised by Director The anomaly of borders, for instance. Shall we take the questions now, sir, your questions, or later?
Actually, I had promised a second round.
Yes.
So if it
That's
is all
fine.
right,
That's fine,
Surya, why don't I open the second round
Yes, sir.
immediately? If you have a question or a comment, raise your hands.
I'm Rajiv Chaturvedi from ISAS. Just a comment to make about your question about structural changes. I see that there is realization, and it has been declared in the joint statement that both countries realize that there is a strategic trust deficit, and they have said that imperatives of forging a strategic trust. And also they outlined, as Surya mentioned in his presentation, that two poles of global architecture. So realizing by Chinese that India is also a pole of global architecture power. Structural changes, this government has introduced the interaction between a state government of India and a state provincial government of China. It was in talk, but now it has officially been announced in, and there was first forum. So that is one structural change. And there are more interactions among institutions, so Ministry of Foreign Affairs and of both the countries as army headquarters, and between Niti Aayog and NDRC. These are some examples of structural changes. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Alvin Wong. I'm from MINDEF. I'm very interested to hear from the panel what are your views about, as we all know, China has brought up the concept of Maritime Silk Road and, of course, the One Belt, One Road concept, whereas India has also come up with something very similar, the Mausam concept. Do you think, especially in the aftermath of Modi's visit, whether India will be willing to cooperate with China, especially on the Maritime Silk Road? Thank you.
One last question or comment? Okay, Surya, I didn't give you a chance last time, so you start this time to respond to this question.
On this Maritime Silk Road initiative and the so-called Indian response in terms of Mausam, the Indian response in terms of Mausam has really not taken off, although it's a maritime issue and I'm using an aeronautic expression. The Chinese One Belt, One Road initiative, of course, is something which India has not yet really responded to positively or negatively, for the simple reason that technically China and India have not come round to discussing the issue threadbare in terms of what China would like India to do and what would be China's expectations of India in terms of access to India. And obviously the feeder road of the One Belt, One Road initiative, namely the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the other feeder, Bangladesh-China, that is BCIM, India-Myanmar on the eastern side, and Chinese access to Sri Lanka, Hambantota and other places, and the northern route towards Europe, up above the Himalayas. All these, from an Indian perspective, will tend to suffocate India because China will have access on all four sides of India. This could be used for military purposes, like all economic projects can be put for military purposes as and when required. That's a given. And then, shall I take your questions now, sir? About the anomaly of borders, of course, and also the issue whether China has hurt India, the mutually hurting stalemate. Obviously, China has hurt India, not so much in terms of at the border itself, because the Chinese did withdraw.
The question was, do the Chinese also get hurt sometimes?
Yes, they do get hurt. More so in recent times when India is teaming up with the US. And most recently, the statement between Modi and Obama about India and China wanting to work together to ensure maritime security in South China Sea itself, specifically mentioned by name. And that is potentially hurtful. It may not have hurt them right now because they haven't yet really started either joint or coordinated patrolling of South China Sea, the US and India. Therefore, that aspect probably, of course, I thought you were asking me to, challenging me to dispute that. And then, of course, one other question is why did nobody else, no other previous Indian Prime Minister had thought of doing the things which Modi wanted to do or is trying to do? Well, I suppose each one had tried in his own way, including Indira Gandhi, of course, they tried in their own ways to interact with China, but then Indira Gandhi's equation with China was defined largely by the 1971 episode, which we have already discussed. But Nehru, of course, was patronizing towards Chawla at one stage, but he paid the price for that. Narasimha Rao, it was during his period that the first real military-related CBMs was conceptualized, the 1993 CBM between Jiang Zemin and Narasimha Rao. And then Vajpayee, and the 96 happened during, if you don't mind my saying that, a pretender prime minister, namely Gowda, who did not have the, of course he was not as much of a pretender prime minister of India as Chandrasekhar was, not Chandrasekhar, Charan Singh was earlier. But then Gowda also should be credited with engaging with the Chinese and signing the 1996, signing means entering into the 1996 CBM, which defined in clear terms as to what the two militaries should be doing along the disputed line of actual control. And that, if I'm not mistaken, that was the first time ever India and China used the terminology of mutual and equal security, which will be, in Israeli terms, it will be secure and defensible borders. So I think the other prime ministers have also tried, but China is too smart for India to have caught up so far. Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, one of my main objectives as director of this institute is to develop an identity of this institute as a place where one goes to get good conversation, of which one can be a part. I would like to thank the panel for having started this conversation and the audience for having continued this conversation. And normally, when we have outsiders presenting, this institute has a ritual of the director handing over a gift. Today, we only have the home team, so I'm not going to give you a gift. Instead, I'm going to ask for a gift. How nice it would be if, Surya, since you are responsible for it, if we could quickly pull these conversations together and came out with a symposium special where some of the questions that have not been answered could be answered, and the audience would then be able to have a sort of an access to the questions asked and not asked. Thank you all. Come back.
But how many papers do you